The DA is heading to the High Court in Pretoria today to challenge the Employment Equity Amendment Act, arguing that it gives the Labour Minister unchecked powers to impose quotas on companies. The second largest partner in the Government of National Unity has launched a constitutional challenge to Section 15A of the Act, which allows the Minister to set equity targets across 18 economic sectors. The party maintains that these are quotas and harm the economy and affects job creation. Let's talk about it with the DA's Federal Council Chair, Helen Zille. Helen, good morning. Welcome to the program as always. Just set out briefly and in the main why you're going to court today.
Good morning, Iman. Well, you said it very clearly and summed it up well. What we have here is a draconian tightening of the employment equity laws to give almost totalitarian powers to the minister to set targets backed by huge fines and the risk of criminal prosecution for firms that employ more than 50 people who don't meet those standards. Now, if you want an instant job killer, it is a law like that. And it's also unconstitutional. Section 9 of the Constitution is the Equality Clause, and Section 9.2 of the Constitution allows a measure of fair discrimination to address the injustices of the past. And that we accept, completely we accept that. But the measures have to still meet the benchmark of fairness, and it is the onus on the people who set the discrimination to determine that the discrimination is fair. And we say that this Amendment Act really does not meet that bar at all.
Yeah.
Because what it does is it says to every company in each of the 18 sectors that they have to meet a sectoral target, not an individual firm's target, a sectoral target set by the minister on pain of being fined 10% of their turnover. Now, for almost all companies, being fined 10% of their turnover puts them out of business.
Right.
That's immediate job losses. And who is going to invest in a country where the minister can tell you what your quotas are and then make sure you are punished severely for not reaching them and sending you into bankruptcy? That is a job-destroying act.
So the ministry has hit back and said that these aren't quotas, that quotas are something else. And it isn't quotas because what you are given the right to do in this particular setting is to justify, in cases where you haven't been able to meet these targets, why you haven't been able to do so. So in other words, saying that there is a flexibility. How does that match up with what you've described as draconian and totalitarian?
Well, firstly, setting a target backed by massive penalties is no longer a target, it's a quota. And if you don't meet that target, and if you're threatened, for example, with losing 10% of your turnover or being criminally prosecuted, the onus is on you to prove why you haven't done that. The onus is on you. The time, the effort, the money. People are going to say, well, I've got capital to invest. I've got a good idea to form a business, but I'm not going to do it in South Africa. I'm going to do it in all the places in the world that are actually making it easier for me to invest, not more difficult.
What's your proof for that?
Well, firstly, it's completely standard that businesses invest where they can get return on investment with the least government interference.
Right, but let's talk about it in South Africa. Sorry, Helen, just to sharpen the question, right? Because this applies to us. So where's that happened to us? What's the evidence for that it's been, for all the reasons that you say, a huge turnoff for investment in South Africa? What facts do we have to back that up?
There have been several studies that have been done, and you can go and Google them, in which businesses have been asked why they aren't investing. And number one reason was always electricity insecurity. And the second most common reason was the race laws and the government's capacity to impose huge bureaucratic obstacles in terms of race laws before companies, and they're not going to invest in those circumstances. So, for example, the most recent example and very high-profile one is the mining industry. Nobody can prospect in South Africa. No one can open a mine. No one can invest unless they give away a third of their investment to BEE partners. And instead of many, many people investing during the commodities boom, there was none because people said, I'm not going to do this. I mean, another very good example is Starlink. We haven't got Starlink because of these kinds of laws. And the critical thing is that the role of government, especially when you've got the highest recorded unemployment rate in the world, the role of government is to make it easier to invest, not more difficult to invest.
Yeah, but for every Starlink you have an Amazon. I mean, Amazon's invested in South Africa. It hasn't been a turnoff for all businesses, and that's why I wanted to go into the detail of actual investment where people said we wanted to put in X billion dollars in South Africa, but we decided not to because of this particular reason. But there's another aspect to all of this, Helen, and this is the reality of where South Africa sits. Do you accept that racial inequality in hiring is still a structural problem in South Africa, or do you believe we've moved past that? Especially when you look at the numbers. White people occupy 7% of the population, 66% of top-level management posts in the private sector. There's the 2023-24 Employment Equity Report. And again, I know you know all of this. Top management, white individuals holding 62%. Of those posts, African individuals who are 80% of the economically active population, occupying only 17% of those roles. And without enforceable targets, many private sector companies have simply refused to transform on purpose. So that's why this law now, my understanding is from what the ministry is saying, has to be tightened to hold people's feet to the fire.
Well, the first point is, where did Amazon invest? They invested in the Western Cape. They invested in the Western Cape because we do our best to remove obstacles for investment. That is why the Western Cape has far lower unemployment rate than any other province in the country, because we make it our business to remove obstacles to investment, to remove bureaucratic hurdles, to take away this racial craziness of race identification. I mean, we're soon going to have a race classification act, because now every employee has to get a form, you fill it in, and you have to note what your race is. Now, who's going to say that I can't identify as a black man tomorrow? And who's going to prove that I'm not? The point is, we're going back to apartheid race classification, where people are judged on their melanin count, not their capacity, not their commitment. And so where you have these fantastic investments that we've had, look at where we've had them and then ask yourself why.
Yeah, but Cape Town's not in an island. I mean, Amazon strategically, and if I just go back to some of their, because we were talking about it deliberately, and I don't have all the facts about the detail around why Amazon invested in South Africa, but you know, it's for all of the reasons that don't only exclusively exist in Cape Town, around internet connectivity, around our ports, around basically being an enabling environment for investment. I mean, Cape Town doesn't exist on its own.
The Western Cape is the most enabling environment for investment in South Africa. And therefore, when a company says we need an investment in Southern Africa, where do they choose? Where the most enabling environment is. And you've answered your own question. So what you've got here, and the issue of top management posts, which is a tiny number of posts compared to mass unemployment. The critical problem is unemployment, not the scramble for top posts in South Africa.
It was just an example, Helen, and also,
But you're interrupting me, Iman. You asked me a long question with lots of statistics, but you don't let me answer.
I apologize. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yes. All right. So if you're going to say to companies, these are all the bureaucratic hurdles that you've got to get through, and they say, forget it, I can invest anywhere in the world, and if I have to invest in South Africa, I'll invest in the Western Cape, which tries to remove those barriers and not increase them. If it is going to create mass unemployment, what's more important? Now, the question here, we've just listened to this tragic story about no money for school feeding. And we heard one of the people say, well, we can't get jobs, so we can't feed our children. So they've got to be fed through the education department. But the education department, which is perfectly transformed in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, can't deliver food to people because of what the Equal Education spokesperson quite rightly says is bureaucratic inefficiency and administrative incompetence. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to try and get food to children? Are you going to try and get people into jobs? Or are you going to start worrying about the 1% of jobs at the very top?
It's a case in point that we've had all this time with all the enabling laws, and we still have that paradigm exist in boardrooms. And it does affect those executives who do want to get in and who are qualified to get in.
Of course, but you see, if you look If you look at the court cases that are taken, I've got a colleague, Michael Bagram. He works in the CCMA 2-3 times a week. He's had 2 cases in all the years of somebody claiming they weren't appointed to a job because they were a person of color. This is not a major problem. People are searching for people of color to put into top positions. And what the impact of this employment equity legislation, even when it was much milder than the new Amendment Act is proposing, the impact is to have taken unemployment from 5.5 million in 2008 to 11.1 million last year. That is a doubling of the unemployment rate. Surely we take this evidence and we look at it and we say anything that is a barrier to employment in South Africa is wrong.
The DDG in an interview was saying that you're hanging too much on the Employment Equity Act, that it's not necessarily a piece of legislation that's designed to create jobs, but to support transformation. The DA says it supports transformation, but without targets or quotas then, what concrete mechanism would the DA use, Helen, to ensure that it actually happens?
You know, this is the point. I mean, imagine an argument like that this isn't a piece of legislation to create jobs. It's a piece of legislation to achieve transformation. But all our evidence shows that this kind of legislation destroys jobs. Is the DDG saying that that's what he wants to do, the DDG of Labour, that he wants to actually destroy jobs? Complete goal displacement. That's what he's doing. And all the evidence shows that. But the DA's proposal for transformation is a very clear one. The more economic growth you have, the more transformation you encourage. That's the simple equation. If you have rapid economic growth, which we believe that our policies can achieve, even if people want to be racist, they can't, because there aren't enough minorities to go around for the jobs that will be created in a booming economy. The critical sine qua non, the point of departure for transformation has to be economic growth. And if you're going to destroy economic growth, you are destroying transformation. You cannot regulate economic growth by putting a cap and by discouraging investment. It's a contradiction in terms. And must our unemployment rate go to 55% before they realize that? You know, Cosatu says that the youth unemployment rate is 72%. What's more important? We've got to get those youth into jobs.
That's true. May I come in?
No, can I just quickly say this?
Sure.
In the not too distant future, even if you have a completely transformed top leadership in the economy, what is that top leadership going to do with a 72% unemployment rate?
Well, it remains to be seen, doesn't it? If they get that chance, maybe we'll see what happens. But I think when you talked about creating economic growth, no one can argue with that. The question in South Africa is inclusive economic growth. It's getting more black people to play key roles in this economy. It's getting them into jobs. And that perhaps is exactly where the question lies, is what do you have on the table besides talking about economic growth? What is the DA's agenda, or, you know, what are you going to do? What is the tool you use to ensure that there are more black faces at senior management levels, that there are more black faces who are making decisions in companies, and more black players, in companies and corporations across South Africa? What is the DA's plan for that specifically?
First of all, I think we both agree that you're not going to get that unless you have economic growth. Secondly, I think we can agree that these measures of the ANC are going to kill economic growth. Those are two givens. So you're never going to have transformation without economic growth. So why is the government killing economic growth in the name of transformation? It's a complete contradiction in terms. Then we have a whole policy called our economic justice policy, which looks at real disadvantage and real drivers of inclusion in the economy, on the basis of genuine disadvantage for which race is no longer a proxy. And the critical question is, how do we get that? And all of our incentives are in that economic justice policy, which are measured against the Sustainable Development Goals. We're the one party in South Africa that has got an entirely non-racial empowerment policy. And obviously, the vast majority of people who will benefit from it are Black people, because the vast majority of excluded people are Black people. But our worry is about including the excluded. And you're not going to get inclusive growth if you don't have growth. And you're never going to have growth if you have measures that kill growth. It's very simple. I don't know why it's so hard for people to grasp.
If the court challenge fails, Helen, will the DA support the law's implementation? I mean, I guess not. How will you continue to resist it politically?
Well, we go on appeal if we lose this case. We've got two particular cases or arguments in court. One is a substantive one in terms of the benchmark for fair discrimination. And we think that this particular law undermines the principle of fair discrimination. It certainly does not meet the benchmark for fair discrimination. That's number one. Number two, we've got a technical argument about the tagging of this particular act. We argue that it should have been tagged Section 76 of the Constitution, and they wrongly tagged it as Section 75. So we've got two major legs to our argument, and we are going to certainly push this right to the very end. And the fact is that if we lose a court case, we're a part of the rule of law. But when we think laws are unjust and don't measure up to the Constitution, we challenge them in court. That's what we do.
Helen Zille, thanks for your time this morning. Really do appreciate it. Our cameras hopefully will be live in the Pretoria High Court when that legal challenge then goes live.